In this section, we will be covering the executive branch. And so your note should just be titled the executive branch. We're not going to be following along with the textbook in this chapter. And so you're going to get your information from these notes and the other activities from this week. And so what we have here in the executive branch, obviously the main portion of the executive branch is the president. And so we have several examples of those presidents there. And so the executive branch is addressed in Article 2 of the Constitution. So if you remember your acronym or our acronym, Little Emily, E for executive branch. So little Emily just saw a silly rabbit. To help you remember those 7 articles of the Constitution, Article 2 addresses the executive branch. And the main duty, kind of the elementary description of the executive branch, is that their duty is to enforce the laws. So we talked about the legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and then we will talk about the judicial branch interpreting those laws. And so the executive branch is smaller than the legislative for sure, and actually smaller than the judicial branch when you consider the entirety of the court system. It includes the president, the vice president, and then the presidential cabinet. And we're going to detail each one of those, but mainly focusing on the presidency. And so first, the qualifications to be president of the United States are that you must be at least 35 years of age. You need to be born in the United States, so a natural born US citizen, and a resident of the United States for 14 years. Give you a moment there to get that down because I know I went through that slide quickly. As we've learned already with the amendments, the 22nd Amendment does set term limits on the presidency, and it limits the president to 2 terms or 10 years. And those term lengths are 4 years apiece. So you might question, how would you get to 10 years? It would involve a scenario where a vice president takes over and serves the rest of that term, and then depending on when they took over, they could run once or twice more, depending on when they took over. So if they took office 1 year into a president's term and served the remaining 3 years, they could run again and be reelected, but that would put them at 7 years. So at that 7-year mark, they would not be eligible to run for president again. However, if they took over for the president 3 years into the presidential term, that vice president could then serve the final year. They could run for re-election, and then 4 years later, that would put them at 5 total years, and then they could run again and potentially be president for 9 years. And the 22nd Amendment was in reaction to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served as president, was elected 4 different times from 1933 to 1945 when he died in office, and Harry Truman took over. And so he led us through getting us out of the Great Depression and through the majority of World War II. But then Congress later passed an amendment making that no longer possible. The salary of the president, this president makes $400,000 a year and is also given a $50,000 a year, what's called an allowance. I assume that's kind of like for expenses, although many of the president's expenses are already covered. And the president does live in the White House, so rent's paid for, obviously. And they have access to Air Force One, best medical care. Again, a lot of benefits that go with the job, but $400,000 a year is what the president makes. And just to kind of put that in perspective, in the NFL, the minimum salary for a player is above that. It's $510,000. So if you are the last man on a 53-man roster in the NFL, you make $510,000 a year, whereas a president makes $400,000 a year. And so when we look at what the president actually does, what their job description is, our president serves these 7 different roles. And so while it's one person, they have many different jobs. I did put in there, he has many jobs. To this point, we've only had male presidents. And so those 7 different jobs, I will say some textbooks and places you'll see will say 6 different jobs, some say 7, some say 8. We're going to roll 7 just for our purposes, and we'll get into each one of these with a little bit more detail, but you can see the 7 different roles that this one person serves. And when we go through these examples, we'll talk about how other countries handle their leadership, because other countries occasionally have multiple people doing these different jobs. So you've got chief of state, chief executive or chief administrator, chief diplomat, commander-in-chief, chief legislator, chief of party, and chief guardian of the economy. And so we'll go briefly into each one of those a little bit over the next several slides. And so first up there is chief of state. And so in this role, the president acts as the living symbol of the nation. In other countries, this position is also often held by someone in the position of king or queen. And this is very much kind of a ceremonial position. Using England as an example, the queen holds very little nowadays, holds very little political power, but is a symbol of the nation. Our president obviously does hold political power, but they also serve in this role as our president, as a kind of the living symbol. So examples of the president acting as the chief of state would be presenting a national award or making a speech on the 4th of July. In 2015, when the Royals won the World Series, they went to the White House and met with and visited President Obama. That's, again, something that isn't necessary for the president to do, but as kind of a symbol of our country, it's a position that the president does hold. The second job you see on the other half of the slide is chief executive. It's typically what we use, but it's also known as chief administrator. And essentially, the president is the boss of the government workers in the executive branch. And we see this when a new president takes office. They hire a lot of people in the executive branch through the appointments of different jobs. Now, we will talk about, and we kind of already have, that Congress gets to approve these appointments, but that shows you how the president is the boss of the executive branch in the position of chief executive. And so when the president is holding meetings with his cabinet, they'll be sitting around a big table with the different cabinet members, and the president is the one getting the information from those different cabinets members about departments or things going on in the world that he needs to know about. And so that is him acting in a position as chief executive. The next 2 are chief diplomat and commander-in-chief. And I think with all of these titles, but these 2 specifically, if you kind of look at the name, you can get an idea of what this role entails. And so chief diplomat is how the president interacts with other nations. So the president determines the relationships between the United States and foreign governments. And so examples of the president acting in that role would be if they traveled to London to meet with British leaders discussing European issues, or if they were to write a message to Russian leaders on weapons control. Those are examples of the president interacting with foreign nations on behalf of the United States government. The other side is commander-in-chief, and I would assume that of all the 7 roles, this is the one that you are probably have heard the most. And as the president, he is the highest position in the military. So the commander of the armed services with the help of Congress. So when you consider military rankings, the commander-in-chief is the top of the military. And so the president acting in this position would be like inspecting a Navy yard. or during wartime deciding whether to bomb a foreign city. That would be a decision that the president would be making in this role as commander-in-chief. And for our presidents, this is something we often don't necessarily associate with their job. Other countries sometimes have their leaders in military uniforms. Our presidents typically don't do that. There have been times when they've worn military uniform, but they are the official head of the military as commander-in-chief. So we've got 4 of the 7 jobs identified, 3 more to go. And so we have chief legislator and chief of party. And again, I think these names signify what they entail. But as the chief legislator, the president does not have the power to make laws, but the president can urge Congress to pass new laws. So something like universal health care that was passed under the Obama administration. That was a platform that he campaigned on. And then when he was elected president in 2008, he encouraged Congress to put the wheels in motion to pass universal health care, became known as Obamacare. And so that shows you President Obama acting as chief legislator. The president can also, is a check on legislative power, veto bills that the president does not like. Now, Congress has the power to override that veto, but that's a good example of the checks and balance power and also the power of the president as chief legislator. And examples of this job would be signing a bill passed by Congress or making a public statement opposing a bill that was pending in Congress. So kind of signaling to Congress that they don't agree with it or the changes need to be made. The other side says chief of party. And so as a member of a political party, the president is the head of that political party. So one of the roles the president does serve is to help members of their political party get elected by campaigning for members who support their policies. So traveling to California to speak at a rally for a party nominee in the Senate would be an example of this. Attending a fundraiser, so there might be something where they host a dinner and donors can pay $10,000 a plate in a big ballroom and say that they, ate with the president. Well, that fundraising is going to the political party that president is a member of. So the president is the chief of their political party that they represent. That is 6 of our 7. The final one is chief guardian of the economy. And so the president is very concerned with the economy. So I'm concerned with unemployment, wages, high prices, taxes, business profits, and the general prosperity of the country and its citizens. However, the president doesn't control the economy, but he can help do things and help encourage things to make it run more smoothly. And so examples of that are down there at the bottom. So meeting with economic advisors to discuss ways to reduce unemployment is an example of the president working in this role, or something like proposing tax cuts so that people have more money in their pockets in an effort to stimulate the economy. So those are the 7 roles, 7 different jobs that our one president takes on. On the next slide, we'll look at the vice president, and then we'll briefly touch on the presidential cabinet. So the Constitution says the vice president has 2 duties. The first is a little bit more nuanced and detailed, but the job laid out in the Constitution says that the vice president acts as the president of the Senate, and so they may cast the tie-breaking vote. And that's really their only involvement in the Senate. If there were a tie vote in the Senate, the vice president would come and cast the tie-breaking vote. The other job for the vice president outlined in the Constitution is simply to take over the presidency if they're needed to. So if the president passes away or is incapable of serving, the vice president moves in and takes over. So those are the two jobs spelled out for the vice presidents in the Constitution. So the executive branch, we've got the president, we have the vice president, and the final part of that was the cabinet. We're switching up the note structure here. Oops. So the presidential cabinet, what it is the different departments each have a representative. So each department is responsible for a certain area of government. And I'll quickly go through some examples of that here in a moment. And so the head of each one of those departments is a secretary and a member of the cabinet. And so the president can't know everything about everything. And so the idea is that the secretaries are experts in whatever field that they are in charge of. And so when the president has a cabinet meeting, he can get updates from all of these different experts and then make informed decisions for what is best for the country. So the cabinet members advise the president and run the various departments. Now, on the next several slides, I'm going to have some examples. There are actually examples under the Obama administration of different cabinet positions. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Do not write them down, but just be aware of these positions. And you might already be aware of some if you just think of the title Secretary of blank. If you can do that, you're identifying cabinet positions. So President Obama, Vice President Biden, this is obviously 2008 cabinet, but we can see Obama and his cabinet pictured there. And so these would be the people who would advise the president in different areas. And so just some examples of those positions. Hillary Clinton served as the Secretary of State, and who dealt with our interactions with foreign nations. We'll go through a bunch. Treasury is another one. Let's see. Department of Defense. So we've got Secretary of Defense. The Attorney General is a cabinet position. Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture. Again, I'm not going to go through each one because you don't need to know each one, but just understand that the presidential cabinet is something that exists as a way for the president to have advisors and provide information on all of the different aspects of what they need to know about for their job. That is it with our notes over the executive branch.